life. And so, this for me was a little bit of a wake-up call. I have pot in this category of totally benign, and that is a toweringly stupid and naive perspective, and this letter is evidence of that.
Right. I think you're not alone in that belief. We seem to have no problem being able to think about alcohol as being both something that's really destructive to many people and also something that's celebrated and used with great pleasure and moderation. And yet we've not yet, I think, as a culture, come to think about marijuana in that same way. So this letter is enlightening.
Yes, let's read it. Let me read it. Dear Sugars, my husband is a drug addict, but he is so exceptionally high-functioning that I'm not sure how I should feel about that. He has a prestigious job, a nice home and family, and by most measures would seem to be a success, to have a charmed life even. He is the love of my life and a great father, but he has smoked pot daily since he was a young teen and now, in midlife, is high most of his non-working hours. So my question is this: is his marijuana addiction a problem, or is it just a problem for me? As weed becomes more acceptable, I'm not sure what I should think anymore. Is it bad and dangerous, or is it simply a tool that helps him more easily find happiness in an otherwise stressed-out life? And is that okay? I wouldn't be writing to you if he was on pharmaceutical antidepressants, for instance, and maybe this is no different. Except that it's so much. On weekends, he starts smoking before breakfast and keeps going until bedtime. On weekdays, he waits until he gets home, unless he smokes on his lunch break or somewhere in the car before he gets home. I'm not supposed to know this because he doesn't do it in front of me, but like all addicts, he's full of ritual and it's obvious. I know exactly why he goes to the basement right before dinner or runs back into the house to check the stove when we're heading out the door, or why, when we have people over, he'll disappear for a few minutes with no explanation. He doesn't believe pot can be smelled on him, but he's wrong. Sugars, I'm not opposed to marijuana. Maybe it's a better choice than spending your life on painkillers or energy drinks or cocktails or too much food. Yes, of course I tried it myself, and yes, I do get it. Marijuana makes many things seem better. But I'm a parent, an employee, and a responsible adult. If I smoked, I would utterly fail at all of those things. But he claims it makes him better at things. Maybe he's right. One thing it doesn't do is make him a better partner. He is so completely absorbed in his own solo experience that I often feel invisible to him, even as I help him create the illusion of non-addiction to our kids, to our friends, and our family. He is mostly oblivious to a lot of things about me. I wish he was more loving and attentive, but every woman I know wishes that, even if their partners aren't using drugs. I have asked him to cut back, and he says he will, and then he doesn't. I have wished that he would just quit altogether, but then when he runs out of weed, which happens about once a year, he changes from kind, mild-mannered dad to the guy who comes home and immediately starts yelling at his kids, who finds fault in everything I do, who walks around under a cloud of such stress and unhappiness that I can't stand to be around him. When he gets restocked, everything is magically better again. Maybe he should just stay stoned for the rest of his life, and I should just stop thinking about it. He has no interest in quitting. It doesn't seem to be hurting him, and apparently I like him better stoned. But I worry that our kids will find out, or that he will get lung cancer or get in trouble. I worry about the psychology of his addiction. Why can't he simply enjoy it in moderation? There must be a reason, and it can't be good. He grew up in a very conservative religious household, and I suspect he started smoking weed as a form of escape. So why is he smoking now? Of course, you already know that what I am most afraid of is that he's smoking so much because of me. Am I prettier, smarter, pleasing only when he's stoned? Is life with young children so unbearably stressful? I think we have a good marriage and family, but I also think he loves weed more than he loves me. And that if he quit smoking pot, things would fall apart. Or maybe I'm just overthinking things. Sugars, do we have a problem here? Or in thinking so, am I just creating one? Thanks for listening. Signed, His Problem or My Problem.
I love that signature because I think so much of the answer to her question is embedded in there. His problem or my problem. Mm-hmm. I think from my perspective, it's both of their problems. This, smoking pot essentially whenever he can, hiding it from her. There are so many things that she mentions that to me really signal that this is somebody who is an addict, right?
Mm-hmm.
He has a ritual. He tries to justify it. He tries to conceal it.
When it goes away, he's a mess.
Right. But anyone who knows anything about having a relationship with an addict knows that partner also often plays a role in the addiction.
Right.
And she's doing this. She's saying, I've tried to conceal it from others. I try to rationalize it. She's really grappling with this. And the first bit of advice that I really want to give to his problem or my problem is the only piece of this that you can really address is the piece that is your problem.
Mm-hmm.
And the ways in which you are codependent with your husband about his addiction. And I really strongly encourage you, his problem or my problem, to seek out people who can give you some insight into this dynamic.
Yep.
Al-Anon, they really help people who have partners who are addicted to alcohol, or parents or siblings or whatnot, people who have intimate relationships with alcoholics, whether they're in recovery or not. But Al-Anon also has, very much branched out to help people who are in relationships with people who have other kinds of addictions, marijuana addictions and so forth. And I really think that it would be so helpful to you, his problem or my problem, to seek out that community. And I want to say first that I'm quite sure I can almost sort of hear you over the airwaves of the podcast resisting that. And I just want to say that is, I think, a lot of people who, before they go to their first Al-Anon meeting, they think, but I don't need to go to this.
It's just pot. Right?
We're different. It's just pot, and really, I what I want to say is, you can start to think about the choices you're making in relation to your husband's addiction. You said he doesn't want to give up marijuana. And we can't make people give up their addictions. When people are addicts, they need to make that change themselves. But what you can do as his partner is set boundaries and start to at least clean up your end of it when it comes to what you're doing to enable him, and also what you're doing in terms of perpetuating your own unhappiness.
Mm-hmm. Put in heroin, put in crack, put in his iPhone, and you're talking about an addiction. You're talking about somebody who you feel deeply within yourself is not fully present with you and the family, and especially with you, and who needs this thing in order to be able to even sort of bear to be with you. That's the fear that's lurking underneath this habitual behavior. In a way, our talking about pot is sort of irrelevant. We could be talking about anything, but what makes it interesting that it's pot is it has become so much more acceptable. And you are profoundly unhappy and feel ignored and very anxious about the basic question, why does he need to smoke? That's what hurts, I think, for people who are involved with addicts, is somehow I'm not enough. There needs to be this other thing to make it bearable, to be married to me and to be in this family. You could hear that in this final paragraph. Is it me? That's a terrible burden to walk around with.
Right. And that kind of thinking, too, it tells us that there's addiction at work here and there's codependency. I want to say to you, his problem, my problem, you do have the right to have a partner who is present for you. You're not asking too much to say, I need you to either learn how to use marijuana moderately or give it up. You say, I wouldn't be writing to you if he was on pharmaceutical antidepressants, for instance. But the thing is those prescription drugs are prescribed to treat a condition, an illness.
Yeah.
Okay? Marijuana, in the way that her husband is using it, it's not being used in that way.
Well, here's the question, and this is another thing I was thinking about as I was sort of focused on the part of the letter. He's got a prestigious job. He's got a nice home and a nice family. It felt to me like both of these people are high-functioning and very aware of wanting to keep it together and, be successful people. It feels like the way that drugs are used and alcohol in this country are much more often a response to a high-stress life that is part of the problem itself, that keeping the prestigious job and the appearance of a happy family is so important that we'll just find whatever medication we can to make that appearance work. And inside of that is lurking people like his problem or my problem who are miserable because you're afraid your husband loves weed more than you. And that's completely unacceptable.
Mm-hmm. I think, too, we keep using this term high functioning,
right?
Which she uses, and we hear this high functioning alcoholic, high functioning pot user, but that doesn't mean that it's not a problem just because they've managed to pull it off. And I would encourage you, His Problem or My Problem. There's Marijuana Anonymous. They have a website. Visit those boards where people are talking about how high functioning they were, or at least believed themselves to be
Right.
during their active addictions, and then what they think of that high functionality now that they are sober and clean. And I'll tell you that I know that they're going to say, okay, the delusion was that I was high functioning. I thought that I was performing at my best. I thought that I was pulling it off and fooling everyone. And just because you're fooling people doesn't mean that you can fool yourself. And all of those people will report that, in fact, they weren't so high functioning after all. And the other thing that's brought up in this letter is, of course, this couple, they have children.
Right.
And his problem or my problem is saying, well, so far we've hidden it from the kids. What happens if the kids find out? And I think this is also sometimes another delusional aspect of being both an addict and the codependent enabler of an addict. And that is to say, well, he's so high functioning that the children don't know. And I would really deeply question that. And we're going to call somebody, a guest, Alex Bloomberg, who himself was the child of a pot addict. He might have something interesting to say to us.
I know he will. All right, let's give him a call.
Hello?
Hi, Alex.
Yes.
Hi, it's Steve Almond. I'm here with Cheryl Strayed.
Hi, Alex.
Hey, how's it going?
Good. How are you?
Good.
Thank you so much for agreeing to speak to us today. Have you read
Sure.
this letter that we've been considering from His Problem or My Problem?
Yes, I did read the letter.
What'd you think?
Definitely his problem.
Can you talk a little bit about your own experience as the son of a high-functioning, no pun intended, dad?
Yeah. So, I mean, so the backstory is, and I did a story about this on This American Life. My dad was a habitual marijuana smoker for much of my childhood, I guess, probably starting from when I was a little kid to, when I was probably in my mid-20s. And it was something that I didn't necessarily know about and didn't realize fully the full extent of it until sort of it came out later when he got sick and certain secrets were revealed.
And did he get sick with lung cancer or something else?
No, he had cancer, but he thought it was lung cancer. He was worried that it was lung cancer.
Uh-huh.
And we were like, it doesn't make sense. And the doctors thought it was lymphoma, which is the good kind of lymphoma, which is a good cancer to get if you're going to get cancer. And so we were very hopeful that he had this good cancer that had a fairly clear path to treatment. But he was sort of like worried that he had lung cancer. And I couldn't understand why, because he'd stopped smoking a long time ago, and the doctors didn't seem to be worried about it. And then it sort of came out that he'd still been smoking pot.
Wow.
Quite a bit.
Do you mean he was smoking on the level that this woman's husband is like waking up and smoking and sneaking off and smoking? Or
Yeah. Yeah, he was smoking every day, multiple times a day.
Mm-hmm.
He would smoke in the morning. He would smoke around lunchtime. He would smoke in the evening. It was a very, very regular part of his routine. Then he would do the same things where he would go, he was always very happy to run to the grocery store, because that's when he would, smoke and, stuff like that.
Right. So what was your experience? You didn't quite realize this until you were an adult, but in retrospect, what did you realize about your father and the impact of his pot addiction on your relationship?
Well, so I will say this about the letter writer. I'm very sympathetic because, I think an alcoholic parent, if it's a bad alcohol addiction, you can't ignore it. It's not something that you're like, oh, I didn't realize till later. Right away. Sometimes it comes with abuse, and it comes with all sorts of crazy behavior, and it's very chaotic and recognizable. And I don't think pot addiction is that way for a lot of people.
Yeah.
I think pot addiction is much more subtle. They don't come home and break things and throw stuff around. What it does, I think, is it just removes you emotionally, which is what's fun about smoking pot, right? You can sort of go deep into your own world and into your own head, and it's like as a recreational drug, there's all sorts of things that are very, very nice about it. But if it's something that people are doing habitually on a daily basis, I think the effect is that it just takes you emotionally out of the scene and creates distance between you and your loved ones.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it's very easy for somebody who is a habitual pot smoker to say to themselves, this is just having a cup of coffee during the day, because I'm not acting crazy. I'm not doing anything weird. There's no sort of big rock bottom that you can get to. You don't black out,
Right.
But I think it can be, insidious because nobody really is sort of like can put their finger on what the effect is, it makes it even easier to deny the effect than it is to deny it with other forms of substance abuse. I mean, if you can deny sort of like a horrible alcohol problem where you're blacking out and getting in fights, you can deny a marijuana addiction much easier.
Do you have specific memories, Alex, of moments where, again, retrospectively, you felt your dad in some way was, as the letter writer puts it, kind of lost in his own solo experience, or was not really checked in to you or your siblings?
Yeah. I mean, there were times, I remember one, and I mentioned this, I think, during the This American Life story, where, we were on this family vacation and we'd arrived at this beautiful spot in Northern California, and it was like after a day of driving, it was this lovely grove with this perfect sort of like pool, and we pulled over and we pitched our camp, and it was like there's still lots of light, and it was just this sort of, it was like glorious, like it was a sort of a glorious scene and a glorious sort of family vacation. And my dad started rolling a joint, and it was just sort of like, I remember at the time it really upset me, and this was before I knew the extent. This was when I was a little kid, I was like 9, and I started crying, and I don't know why. At that time, like I certainly wasn't aware that my dad was a addict or anything like that. But what I did feel was like, you're removing yourself somehow.
Right.
You're separating yourself from us.
Yeah.
And like, what is it about me that I'm not enough? That's the feeling that I had. I remember feeling that pretty clearly.
Wow. I just want to say, so this part of the letter, she asks that same question. Why am I not enough?
Right.
So it sounds like you had that same experience in a different kind of relationship, but that you understood that piece of the letter.
Feeling, and and you're like, I'm in this reality that you're retreating from, and like it's okay here, and it would be better if we were all in it together. And why are you retreating from it? Why are you running away from it? Why do you need this thing to sort of spend time in a beautiful location with your family that you love? Like what could be better about this?
Right.
And I understand from the perspective of the smoker, like I understand how that feels like sort of weird and whiny and like sort of like, because I like a beer, you know what I mean? Like I understand that like sometimes it's fun to sort of like, augment that with like a little bit of a, whatever, something. So it's not like as judgmental as all that, but that's the feeling when I was younger. And then later on, when I was much older, my dad, as I was growing up, he started sort of a successful advertising agency in Cincinnati where we lived, and then he eventually sort of like sold his stake in the company and sort of went to pursue other stuff. And the pursuing the other stuff, I think that was when it really sort of became clear the extent to which it was, sort of having an effect on his perception. Like I think he had sort of a lot of ideas about sort of businesses that he was going to launch after leaving the agency, and those felt, sort of pot-heady, And I think that there's a thing that you do when you sort of launch a career. It requires bravery, like knowing that you could fail and facing that possibility of failure. And like you have to get through that to sort of achieve sort of like success, and everybody recognizes that, and it's a terrifying thing to do. And I think marijuana allowed my dad to never face those feelings. It allows you to retreat from these unpleasant feelings that unless you go through them, you're sort of held back. And so it allows you to live in this world of dreams where you don't necessarily have to achieve anything. It robs you of your initiative in a certain way. And so that's the other thing, is that it's sad to watch that a little bit. And it's so nice to have seen him emerge from that and just be more present and real.
Were your parents married to each other all through your childhood?
Yeah, and they still are today. Yeah.
And they still are. So your father is still alive. He didn't succumb to his illness.
No. The cancer was cured, and he, after a while, and sort of for a while after that, he continued to smoke pot, and then we kept on telling him, like, you're not going to be able to kick this on your own. You need to get into treatment. And then eventually, a friend of his, who also smoked, had sort of been a habitual pot smoker, told him that she was in AA, and she really liked it, and so he got into AA. And
he did.
AA.
Wow.
Yeah.
So I have a couple of questions for you. One is, have you talked to your mother about the impact that your father's addiction had on her and their marriage?
Yeah.
What does she have to say about it?
I mean, we didn't have a big sit down where she was like, I almost left your father. It wasn't like, there was never like she doesn't have that accent in the first place, but I think there was a period in their relationship where she was very fed up.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there was a period where it was like, it was a big problem and she was mad and resentful.
Mm-hmm.
And felt, I think the feelings that this letter writer just cast forward 25 years. And like the letter writer right now is feeling all these feelings like, imagine yourself in this relationship for 25 years, nothing changes.
Mm-hmm.
Imagine the level of resentment you're going to feel.
Mm-hmm.
However slighted you feel right now,
right,
it's not going to get better.
And her sense that the kids don't know at this point, she could be mistaken about that. I think, you describe yourself at 9 being upset because your dad's smoking a joint, even though rationally you don't oppose somebody smoking a joint at the end of the day. But I think my sense is that probably some part of you actually knew.
Of course, yeah. Kids pick up on all sorts of things.
Yeah.
And you can't hide anything from your kids. Nothing is hidden from your kids, really. And, I have kids now, and so I know,
right.
If there's any sort of undercurrent of something about it, they're like picking up on it. And, they can tell, they get quiet when something weird is going on or whatever, they just know. And so I'm sure I was picking up on that my mom was unhappy about it or,
right.
That something was going on.
Yeah. So your dad, before we got on the phone with you, I really strongly recommended that this letter writer seek out Al-Anon and that, if her husband's ready, doesn't sound like he is, but that Alcoholics Anonymous or, some sort of similar thing could be very useful to him. So your dad went to AA. Could you tell us how long has he been in recovery and what's that? I know you can't speak for him, but, as an observer, how has that been for him and for you as a family?
It's been fantastic. I think it saved, nobody has ever said that, but I think it probably saved his life. I think it probably saved my parents' marriage. It's made it so that, like, my dad and I can have, like, that story that we did on This American Life, like, I didn't really think about it. The idea was just, like, we're going to do a story about being high, sort of like what's going on while people are high. And I didn't think of it as anything really more than a story. But of course, once I did that story, it was like it became sort of like it wasn't like it was a turning point because like my dad and I, our relationship is good. But it was like we hadn't really talked about it that much. And it was the most we'd ever talked about that period in his life and the most we'd ever sort of like shared those feelings with each other. And I didn't realize like all the feelings I had about it really, and I don't think he fully understood it. So if he hadn't gone into recovery and sort of like recognized the thing that everybody around him saw, none of that would have been possible. Addiction is this thing where everybody around you sees this thing about you, this truth about you that you don't see, and it's just so frustrating to your loved ones to have to live that lie. And it's such a relief when you are able to sort of see it, and like it just makes everything better.
Wow.
Yeah, well, Alex, I trust that his problem or my problem is listening very carefully to this because you're really telling the story from 25 years on or so, and
right.
It puts it in very sharp relief. What would you, Alex, say to his problem or my problem about how she needs to start to address this? For your dad, it sounds like there was this, horrible diagnosis that, if not scaring him straight, certainly caused him to have to be more honest about his use and its potential effects. But this is a situation where, as far as the letter writer is concerned, her husband doesn't think it's a problem. So how does she start to bridge that gap?
God, that is the hardest thing. Because I don't know. I don't know if my dad, and even after, it was so weird. Like with my dad, like he got cancer. It was this terrifying thing. We all came back. He had to go through chemo. He lost all his hair. We learned about the extent of the addiction. We all realized it was a problem. And then there was like many, many months, if not a year, where he was like, I'm going to quit. I'm going to quit. I'm going to quit. And we kept saying like, you can't do it by yourself. You can't do it by yourself.
Right.
And he would not get help. And I wrote him impassioned emails saying like, I remember I wrote him this email saying like, what if every time you came to visit me, I pulled out a 6-pack of beer and just drank it in front of you while you were waiting, and that's what I did every single interaction we had. Wouldn't you feel worried about me? Wouldn't you want me to get help? And what if I kept saying to you, no, I'm fine. That's how it feels. And none of it worked. And then he just ran into this friend of his one time on the street, and she was like, yeah, I'm in AA, and I realized I had an addiction to marijuana. And he was like, oh, and the bell went off. So I don't know to what extent, like, I was like, fine, like, thank God, you know what I mean? But it was always like, what, and I don't know if, like, if he had run into her and I hadn't been doing all that, like, then would that have worked, So you got to keep trying. But I don't know. I mean, that's one of the hardest things about it is, like, you can't force anybody to do it.
No, you can't.
And it's sort of like, it's ultimately up to you. You have to, we all know this as the person who's living. And my mom, it was the same decision my mom had to make, which is sort of like, what am I going to put up with for myself? It's ultimately, it's a decision that you have to make, and it's a crappy decision.
Right.
You have to either decide, I'm going to continue to live with this in this way that is like really, really horrible and sad for me, or I'm going to leave in a way that's going to be horrible and heartbreaking and terrible. And like, there's not really any other solution.
Well, that's the reality of it. So, that's probably the best answer we can, hope to provide her. The question, the dilemma that this woman faces is, if he does quit smoking pot, if somehow I can prevail upon him or forces prevail upon him, maybe things fall apart. Maybe the family falls apart. This is why people remain in a codependent enabling situation, because at the other side of it is, what if the person does not consent to this? It's very cavalier to say, well, you got to stop enabling him. But then the reality of it is, well, if I do that, maybe I lose the relationship.
Yeah.
Well, Alex, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us. It's absolutely, for me anyway, very clarifying.
Sure, absolutely. It was a pleasure, and I wish your reader all the best.
Thank you. We love talking to you.
Thanks, guys.
Bye, Alex.
Take care.
All right. Bye.
Last Seen, a new podcast from WBUR and the Boston Globe, investigates the largest unsolved art heist in history.
So about the time that he begins putting the duct tape on, he says, this is a robbery.
The theft of $500 million worth of art from the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston.
When the FBI says, we solved it, we know who did it, it's like, no, you don't, because you don't have the paintings.
Subscribe and listen to Last Seen now on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts.
Sponsored by Samuel Adams and ADT Smart Home.
I'm Michelle Goldberg.
I'm Ross Douthat.
And I'm David Leonhardt. We're the hosts of The Argument, a new podcast from the New York Times opinion section. These days, it's more important than ever to listen to people who disagree with you. Maybe they'll teach you something new. Or maybe they'll just teach you how to beat them. So listen to The Argument from the New York Times. Subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you like to listen.
So most of our advice has really been, understandably, directed to our letter writer for good reason. She's the person who has to decide how to discuss this with her husband, the sorts of steps she might want to take before she does such a thing, certainly attending meetings and learning more about and trying to understand more about what brings him to his addiction to pot. But I think having listened to Alex, it's also worth hoping that his problem or my problem might actually listen to this episode with her husband. And I want to direct a few words to the husband in this case, who I hope is listening. Based on really, what Alex had to say, which is there is a difference to be drawn between being somebody who is functional in your work and your family life and somebody who's actually present emotionally and psychologically. And that is the thing ultimately that you two are going to have to discuss and work out. Her question or her worry that you love pot more than you love her should really be something that rattles you to your foundation, because that's your wife, and that in her perception, it is pulling you away from a real connection with her and your kids is something that isn't just going to affect you in the here and now. As you heard from Alex Bloomberg, it's going to affect you and your kids for the rest of their lives and maybe affecting them in ways that you're not even conscious of.
Right. Are they going to have that same kind of awakening that Alex had in his 20s when he looked back and said, this is why I always felt like my father wasn't fully present with me? Do you want to be sitting there 20 years from now listening to your adult children tell this story about you, the story that the father who was great in all of these ways, but not present for them? And I think that that's really what we're talking about here. You know, life is hard. The daily grind of things are difficult. There are all these reasons we want to escape it.
Yep.
But this sounds like to me like a man who does want to have a good life. He's high functioning because he's good at a lot of stuff. He's keeping this ball in the air as a father and this ball in the air as a husband and as you know, keeping a job. But ultimately, I think he can do better. And I hope that that conversation with Alex will make this couple reflect on what's happening to them as a family and as parents.
Right, as an entire family system.
Mm-hmm. One of the sugar columns that I wrote addressed to a parent who was grappling with feeling guilty. I want to say this to the husband here, is that, you know, I think sometimes there can be this feeling of like, okay, I've already messed it up. I can't move forward. Mm-hmm. And I think always as parents we're saying, should I have done better? I could have done better. But I think the most important question is, did you fix it when you fucked it up?
Right.
You know, and Alex's father did, and he did much later than is ideal. And one of the bright lights in the heart of this sad letter is it's not too late for this family. This is a man whose wife still really loves him. Yep. And his kids are still living at home. And he can make that choice to be present for them.